I think there are many scientists who are curious and interested in the world, but they have to have a career, they've got a mortgage to pay, a family to support. And the scientific world is very intolerant of what's regarded as heresy. My family had a willow farm where they grew willow trees for making baskets. And when I was staying with my great aunt who ran the farm, I saw a row of wooden posts of willow trees with wire hanging between them. And I asked why there was wire between these trees. They told me they had made a fence out of these posts and the wood had come to life. And they turned into trees. From seemingly dead wood, they turn into trees. So I was very interested in the way that nature could regenerate. And much later, when I was doing my PhD at Cambridge, I found how small pieces of stem regenerated and formed roots and shoots. I hadn't thought about this childhood memory from about the age of 5, but it was a key part of my understanding of nature, that it had tremendous powers of regeneration. My father, who was a pharmacist and a herbalist, had a microscope laboratory, and he introduced me to nature. He explained to me about plants, and I did biology at school and at university because I was really interested in plants and animals. What caused me to doubt some of what I was being taught was the fact that the first thing we did with the animals and plants we were studying was to kill them. So we were always studying dead animals and plants, not living animals and plants. And the questions that most interested me as a child, for example, how do pigeons find their way home, didn't seem very relevant in the context of killing animals and grinding them up to look at their enzymes and their DNA. So I began to feel that biology had rather missed the point of what life is and was really studying simply molecular mechanisms rather than actual life. I was an undergraduate at Cambridge and I also did a PhD there. The subject I found most congenial was botany, because in the botany department at Cambridge there were people who actually studied plants and went out into the fields, into the woods and explored jungles in tropical countries and really knew about plants, living plants. But in physiology and biochemistry, the atmosphere was one of reductive materialism. We grind things up, we find out what parts are within them, how the parts work with each other, and we explain everything as lifeless mechanisms. So it was a very materialistic atmosphere. I was rather depressed by this mechanistic, materialist approach. A friend of mine who was studying German literature introduced me to the ideas of Goethe, the German poet and biologist and scientist, and really a natural philosopher. And Goethe's holistic approach, the idea that you could understand things by looking at them and directly seeing patterns in nature, that everything was interconnected, that there was an inherent polarity in animals and plants. These ideas seemed to me much more interesting than what I was being taught in Cambridge. So they also opened up to me the prospect of a kind of holistic science that didn't involve reducing everything to its parts and trying to break everything down, but could see the interconnections between things. I worked at Cambridge for 13 years altogether as a student and doing research. But then I came to the point where I wanted to do something completely different. I took a job in India at an agricultural institute where I was working on the physiology of chickpeas and pigeon peas, helping to breed better crops, mainly for poor farmers. While I was there, I was developing my ideas about morphic resonance, which I first had when I was at Cambridge. And I reached the point where I wanted to write a book about it. The basic idea that was inspiring me at that stage was an idea that came to me while I was in Cambridge. And I was trying to understand how biological form develops, how embryos, animal embryos, and how growing plants develop. how a form comes into being. And the genetic material, DNA, was not enough to explain this, because in a plant, for example in a rose, the stem, the leaves, the flowers, the roots, all have the same DNA. All the cells contain exactly the same genetic information. And yet the leaves and the petals and the roots and the stems and the thorns have different shapes. So how did that happen? Well, since the 1920s, a number of developmental biologists have been suggesting that developing organisms are shaped by morphogenetic fields. And I thought this idea was a really good idea, and there must be these fields, a bit like invisible magnetic fields, which give shape to things. You can't see the fields, but they shape things. We're already familiar with invisible fields like the gravitational and the electromagnetic fields. And this idea was that there's another kind of field shaping living organisms, like an invisible mold or blueprint. The problem is no one understood how these fields could be inherited, and I didn't think they could possibly be inherited through the genes, which code for proteins, not for fields of form. So it suddenly occurred to me when I was in Cambridge that if there was a kind of memory in nature, these fields could be inherited by an influence across time from past organisms by a process I called morphic resonance. Morphic from the Greek word form, resonance like acoustic resonance or electromagnetic resonance, where similar things interact. I went back to England and I rewrote the book with lots of input and feedback from colleagues in Cambridge and elsewhere. Some people thought I shouldn't pursue this idea. One of my colleagues at Cambridge, a retired professor who took an avuncular interest in me, advised me that these ideas were going to spoil my career. So I asked what was his advice. And he said, well, just don't talk about this, just keep quiet until you've retired. Well, I was about 25 at the time he gave me this advice, and so the idea of doing nothing about the idea that excited me most for the next 40 years didn't seem a very attractive piece of advice to me. But he was right. When I did publish the book, it meant that I couldn't get a normal job in a university or laboratory space. So it definitely derailed my normal scientific career, and it made me go onto a completely different path. Some people got very angry and said this is scientific heresy, that the book should be burned. The editor of Nature magazine wrote a famous editorial in Nature on the front page of the most important international scientific journal in the world, compared my book unfavorably to Mein Kampf by Hitler, said that I was trying to introduce magic into science. And he also said, when interviewed by the BBC about this, that my book and I deserve to be condemned in the same way and in the same language as the Pope condemned Galileo, because this was heresy. And of course, he missed the irony, because it turned out Galileo was right. So it also was ironic, because the editor of Nature was a militant atheist, and he was comparing himself to the Pope and science to the Roman Catholic Church. So the whole thing was very ironic, but it did mean that I couldn't get a job in the academic world from then onwards, nor any grants for my research. So he was quite effective in condemning me, excommunicating me from the scientific mainstream. Of course, my publishers were delighted, because after his condemnation and all the controversy that it caused, my book sold much, much better, and they had to keep reprinting it. It was a publishing phenomenon, but it was not good news for me, really, scientifically. The controversy following the publication of my book, A New Science of Life, made my life more difficult in terms of scientific research, getting access to laboratories and scientific funding. It made my life much more fun, though, because I was no longer within the conventional framework of the academic world, and I started meeting all sorts of interesting people I would never have met otherwise. I actually encountered a much more exciting intellectual world. Since then, I've been able to work as an independent scientist because, unpredictably, a number of wealthy people really liked what I was doing and have supported my work. So I have been able to get funding for my research, but not through the usual academic channels. Most people keep quiet about their deeper interests, and most scientists are working in very specialized fields, and they just get on with their specialized research. Maybe in their free time, they take psychedelics or read more holistic books or think more philosophically. But at work, they're on a kind of treadmill of getting grants, publishing papers, because you have to publish papers in high citation index journals to get promoted and to get more grants. So most of them don't want to take the risk of losing their jobs or losing their careers or not having funding for their laboratories. So they're not as adventurous or as curious as they could be. So I think this is a serious limitation based on fear, but it's very understandable.